Such a full space here to support and listen to our very own Michael Ceragioli. Welcome, Michael, and his wife, Allie. Michael, in case you don't know, has been busy in the church since he graduated and left town. He currently teaches theology and spirituality and serves as the program director of the Certificate in Evangelization with the St. Bernard's School of Theology and Ministry. He's studying for his PhD in spirituality at the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas. He's the author of Sent Forth, along with Ignacio Llorente. Yes, I just finished the book. It's very good. I enjoyed that very much. And please remember to autograph it. They have a couple copies if you're interested in one yourself after the presentation. I think they're $20. With no further ado, we welcome Michael to inspire us this evening. Thanks again for coming to join us.
Okay, inspire us, call to order. Thank you, Debbie, for coordinating all this, and also to Father Jorge for inviting me and making this happen. Father Jorge, when he introduced me at the 9 a.m. Mass, he compared me to Jesus. He says it's like Jesus returning to his hometown. And then I said, wow, what a favorable comparison. But if you remember when Jesus returned to his hometown, he was driven to the edge of a cliff. So if anything goes wrong tonight, I am going to stand behind blaming Father Jorge and his prophecy for that situation, rather than whatever it is that I have to say. My dad also warned me. He said, be cautious up there because, Michael, you're going to leave on Friday and we have to stay. So we're going to deal with it. Okay, so what I'm doing here tonight is I gave a series of 4 talks on this topic in Portland just this past month. And so I've done my best to radically condense those 4 talks and turn it into one. Allie, quite helpfully, my wife, provided a handout. If you get lost and you're looking for a grip, you can turn to that handout and kind of see the larger structure at the top. But the idea is to assess from the vantage point of spirituality rather than, say, history, the phenomenon of being Catholic in America. What are the particular challenges that arise in our context, and how can we contend with that? So spirituality being, just a quick definition, that's what I'm studying. You can consider it theology on 2 feet. You can consider it the art of discipleship, something to that effect. It's how we apply what we receive in church. It's how we live out our lives in union with Jesus. So I thought, for the sake of these talks, that I would take on what has come to be the word on the tip of everybody's mouth, the kind of negative word of what we find ourselves struggling with, and that is polarization, right? You hear this notion that we find ourselves entrenched, sort of encamped across the aisles, whether it be in politics and sometimes in the Catholic Church as well. And there's kind of something that's set in, a sense of maybe pessimism or defeatism about overcoming that polarization. The way that a woman in my church community brought it up to me, she said, it's difficult. I can see this even in my marriage being a Catholic, and then also in certain church circles. I feel like I can stand for truth or I can stand for unity, but it's hard to stand for both. Because if I stand for truth, I find that I have to stand sometimes against others. And when I find myself sort of seeking unity, I worry that I'm only promoting a sort of superficial peace, like the person at the dinner table who disagrees with everything that's being said, but sort of nods and laughs along, right? So she says, how in my spiritual life can I reconcile, right, these sort of twin commissions of discipleship? And what I want to do tonight, I don't intend to solve any problems necessarily, but I want to suggest that a certain way forward when we're asking these kinds of questions is to sort of step behind the issues that most concern us, not enter into the disputes or the disagreements that we struggle with right away, but to look at our perspective, to understand our journey of faith through the lens of conversion, this one step back approach. And what do I mean when I'm talking about conversion? Conversion, if we go back to the Greek metanoia in the Gospels, means to change one's mind. You could even say to embrace a higher mind, or to get beyond the mind that you have. Conversion is always about your own transformation. And so I'm suggesting that as we deal with certain conflicts in the church and our own hearts, we take that step back and understand the challenges in the American context to our own larger conversion. And the conversion journey, this is kind of the fruit of it as you can understand it, always involves new sight, or better, a new way of seeing, a kind of cleaning of the lens. Like if we look back to St. Paul, remember when he fell down on his journey to Damascus, he lost his vision temporarily, and of course regained his sight, and was able to see anew, fresh, with the vision that was given to him through his encounter with Jesus. So too, we can talk about the disciples on the road to Damascus who encounter Jesus and have their eyes opened in that encounter. So kind of the sudden form of conversion, or the more gradual conversion of the disciples on the road to Damascus. In any case, we're talking about this new way of seeing. And one way to assess our conversion, because the gospel is practical in so many respects, there's a deep spiritual interior dimension to it, but it has fruits, it has application. We can say that conversion will invariably lead to mission. The primary fruit of being converted is to have some way of, in your community, seeking both these unity and truth poles, but finding yourself going out, speaking in the name of the Lord, promoting Christ in all that you do. So there's a way to look at and assess conversion, and that's kind of what I want to point out as we go forward. Before we get into the American context in particular, let's define conversion a little more exactly, right? Because you can be converted in the sense of, this classic sort of gospel sense of being converted to Christ and the renewal of vision that happened with St. Paul. But you can also be converted in what we could call more secular ways, right? You can be intellectually converted when you cease to sort of live from your own silo or fixed vantage point, where you don't want to ask sort of more difficult questions, where you come to see truth anew and receive vantage points that you had previously been closed off to. You can be morally converted when you finally find your way to authentic personal values that you embrace each day of your life, rather than sort of just flowing with the tides of your social life. You can be affectively or psychologically converted when you no longer allow the wounds of your past life to dominate you and to condition sort of your relationships. That you can see the people in your life afresh and come from the needs of your environment rather than the hurts of your past, right? And you can also be, you could say, socio-politically converted when you move out from the enclave that tends to condition your awareness and find your way in the deeper solidarity with the poor, the excluded, those to whom you tend not to see as you go through your days. So there are all kinds of dimensions of human life that we can talk about with conversion. And we can say that a change in one area of life leads to a change in the others. There's this kind of co-strengthening through conversion. And I want to talk about these dimensions, or at least bring them out at the outset, because this gives us a way of focusing our attention. We can say that our complaints about people in our lives will fall predominantly, often according to one of these dimensions of conversion. If only they were more morally resolute, if only your sister was more morally resolute, or something like that. If only your parents would see reality with a wider point of view, if only they were intellectually converted, if only your son and daughter, in the ultimate form of conversion, could come to Christ, then how much better our relationships would be. So you can understand that we should also turn our vision to ourselves, right? So too, just as the complaints that we have about others might be pointed out according to these different lenses of conversion, so too the complaints that people have about us sort of focus on the ways in which we haven't come all the way. So as we move forward in this talk, let's invoke Jesus's beam and splinter principle, right? Before you go to remove the splinter from your neighbor's eye, first attend to the beam in your own, and then you'll see clearly so as to remove that splinter. Okay, so I talked about these secular forms of conversion, if you will. We're talking about a kind of integral sort of humanity. The capstone in any kind of conversion is Christian conversion, which infuses a meaning, a sense of wholeness through all the other dimensions of your life. There's St. Thomas Aquinas has a great formulation. There's one that you can kind of put in your back pocket. And he says that grace heals, elevates, and perfects nature. So for our moral life and our intellectual life and our psychological life, to receive grace, to come closer to God, is to heal all those dimensions, is to elevate them, and to bring them to a kind of wholeness. So when we're converted in Christ, when we have that kind of experience, that kind of movement in our lives, some things start to kick in. There's a deeper awareness of hope, even amidst extenuating or difficult circumstances. There's a basic trust that sets in the goodness of life. And there's a growth in a sense that can be hard to describe, but nonetheless is present, a growth in the sense that you are not alone. As we're converted, we move towards an acceptance of God's presence as conditioning the decisions that we make, and we're called into a personal relationship with the triune God. This is what conversion means. And Christian conversion, the final mark of it, we could say, is to love even one's enemies. There's no other form of conversion. We can talk about moral conversion. There's no sort of natural way to get beyond ourselves and truly love our enemies. We require the grace, the gift of God's presence. As Jesus points out, it's easy enough to love our own, the people who are good to us, who invite us over to dinner, our friends and family, and so on. But to love one's enemies is an extra sort of challenge. And only through the love of Christ is this possible. So it's not to say that to be converted is to move along any kind of smooth trajectory. Of course, we're always moving in fits and starts. As I was speaking to, I sponsored someone in Portland, and as he was entering the church, he said, wow, it's starting to get scary as I move forward to this kind of final commitment. And he says, my feeling is as if I'm like moving to the edge of a high dive, right? My legs are starting to shake because I realize there's something that I'm committing to, a kind of change of life that really demands something of me. And whatever that something is, I know will be difficult, right? So to take the leap is something that is totally new for him. He was a doctor. He'd been through all these sort of stages of initiation and success in his career. He said nothing compares to this movement, this jump off the high dive. So we can be not always comfortable with the process of conversion. It entails a kind of risk and this sort of difficulty, but we can embrace it amidst the fear. Okay, so all that prelude, so as to move us into our American context. Actually, one more point of prelude before we get there. Because the paradigm that I want to use, and make sure that we all get this, if you have a question, go ahead and ask it, is the paradigm of Moses in Pharaoh's house. So remember, Moses, Old Testament figure, he was raised as a member of the royal household, of Pharaoh's household. And of course, the Egyptians are ruling over the Hebrews at this point in time. So here's Moses, ensconced in this kind of privilege and comfort. And he could have just lived out his life that way until he sees the condition of his people in slavery. And his heart goes out to them. Moses goes ahead, not to be followed in this regard. He kills one of the Egyptian slave masters, who's really driving his people into the ground. But what had first happened was he made that movement of the heart, this kind of empathetic movement into solidarity with his people. And so he went on as God's messenger to lead his people to the promised land, and on his way had to experience several conversions. We could talk about that first conversion, from identifying with the Egyptian overseers to then becoming one with his fellow Hebrews, a kind of moral conversion or conversion of the heart. And then we can talk about what was his properly spiritual conversion. When God speaks to Moses in the burning bush and he's given his mission, that's when he really begins to move forward. So the reason why I want to use this paradigm is I feel that in the United States, and I'm getting some help from a professor at the Oblate School of Theology who helped formulate this. He says, in the United States, we are often like Moses in Pharaoh's house, right? Our land of plenty, of privilege and comfort, and the most difficult movement in the United States is a movement into solidarity. So how is it that we embark on this conversion journey? As Moses had to transfer his loyalties from his Egyptian overseers to the Hebrew people, How can we transfer our loyalties to the kingdom of God? How can we risk giving up some of our entitlements in order to identify with our brothers and sisters? And so we're in this situation. We, in so many respects, are Moses and Pharaoh's house. So I propose that we could speak about a couple of walls of Pharaoh's house, and that's how we're moving forward. So just in summary, moving from this situation of polarization to recognizing the lens of conversion as fundamental, the paradigm of Moses in Pharaoh's house as sort of giving us an imagination for our American context. Now I want to see, what is it? What are the barriers? What are the kind of obstructions to the fullness of our conversion in the United States? What is the kind of collective vision, the cultural forces that keep us from truly living out the gospel truth? And the first that I suggest, I'm going to suggest two tonight, is a culture of radical individualism. Radical individualism and the palliative culture that it spawns. And by palliative culture, I mean the kind of culture that is fearful of going down to the root of things. It's fearful of addressing issues at its source. The second wall is a wall of systematic envy and the culture of competition and restlessness that it engenders. Certain marketplace dynamics at play here. So let's get into, we'll start with the first wall. This is a wall of radical individualism, right? How are we kept in many ways from moving out of privilege and comfort and finding ourselves serving the kingdom of God? So we could say, and you can confirm this, or contest it, up to you, that there's a kind of habit of thought in the United States where personal happiness is placed above all other considerations. It can be the tendency to be fed in that kind of way. Of course, we have the pursuit of happiness written right into the Declaration of Independence. And there's a way in which success, our personal success, not often connected with a broader community, becomes the sort of operative American word. We sort of test ourselves according to this, or judge ourselves according to our successfulness oftentimes. And I remember when I came back, just to tell a little Tahoe story, I would come back often, especially when I got out of college, for the 4th of July celebrations. And every year, like when I was a kid growing up and in high school, we'd always go down to the beach, and loved it or hated the dark side of the 4th of July and incline. It's kind of a big community festival, right? You get to see people you haven't seen in a while. You make these strange kind of uncanny connections. There's a sort of beauty to it. And I remember my friend who was studying had just wrapped up his degree over on the East Coast. I was hanging out with him before we were going to go down to the beach. And I said, okay, you ready to go? Let's embrace everybody again. Let's go through this whole thing. And he says, no, I don't think that I want to go because I don't have a job yet. And I don't think that I'm ready to like show my face down there. I've got to get a job, and then people can see me, and then I can greet them, and then we can have this kind of compassionate encounter again, right? And so I thought this is a sort of situation that in many ways sums up some of the more harmful dynamics that we find ourselves in. Not that he didn't have certain good reasons for that, but what we can see at play here is his participation in community. For him, success, or the notion of success, the appearance of success, became a precondition for his participation in community. And I think oftentimes he's not the only one who looks at the world in that way. You know, we can talk about what becomes a typical sort of story for American fathers oftentimes. Of course, there's a challenge of providing for your family, putting bread on the table. There's also a way of sort of seeking to succeed to excess, right? Whereby you're kind of chasing a dream or chasing a certain image or a certain place on the corporate ladder, if you will. And we see so often in American culture, this story of the father who turns back to his family, maybe when his kids are teenagers or even later than that, and will say something like, I wish that I would have turned to my family sooner, right? I wish I wouldn't have chased these idols for so long. There's a sense of this, of just getting caught up in something of a warped perspective here. And tied up with this culture of success, if you want to call it that, is the overwhelming American vision that is also coordinated right back to our founding of freedom from external constraints. Right? We see that in the Declaration of Independence. It's kind of in our DNA, gaining independence from the British. But our notion of freedom oftentimes can be something of an empty freedom, right? Whereby freedom means that we've broken away from the bonds that can sort of cramp our style, right? That can prevent us from becoming the people that we think we should be. And whereby freedom can be conceived of as just having a lot of options or choices or in a kind of accumulation of possibilities. Now, there are two notions of freedom, and both of these are present in the Catholic tradition. But I think the stronger one, which goes to St. Thomas Aquinas, doesn't see freedom or the fullness of freedom as having the most options available, right? Having the most kind of before you, like a grand buffet of choices, but sees freedom as the freedom to do the good, the freedom to be virtuous. And that's a bit of a different notion of freedom. We can parse it as freedom from shackles, as often being an easier American vision that we can talk about, or freedom for, which is freedom for the good, freedom to live out your life in love. And sometimes in the United States, we're caught up a little bit in the first rather than the second notion. Okay, so to expand on this a bit, we can talk about as well two models of individual fulfillment. Wherein the traditional Christian pattern that we're pointing out here is this pattern of conversion and discipleship, of being changed in your heart, of coming to God. And what does God do? God leads you to community, God leads you to church, God leads you to a kind of charismatic, and by that I mean charismatic in the sense of gifted participation in a certain form of Christian community, whereby you not only use your gifts, but discover your gifts in a communal context. And in the United States, being birthed in the time of, coming off of very much an Enlightenment sort of sensibility, everything in the world sort of betrays, in some sense, the seeds of its birth, the historical situation of its birth, and the United States is no different. In the United States, we have a bit of a model of individual fulfillment tied up with this success-driven mentality and a certain notion of freedom that we could call radical individualism. There, Robert Bellah, the sociologist, pointed out two strains of radical individualism. The first he calls utilitarian individualism, and that's the idea that the highest good of the whole is attained when each individual focuses on the maximization of their own potential. So this is kind of an idea, we can connect it with economics or Adam Smith and the invisible hand kind of idea that as long as the invisible hand in the marketplace, as long as each person seeks their own good, then everything else will sort of take care of itself and we'll have prosperity for all. You can trace it to Benjamin Franklin as one of its progenitors. So that would be our utilitarian or maybe a more economic notion of individualism. The other is expressive individualism, that speaking of conversion that you want out of people, as parents will often see this sort of dialed up too much in their children. Expressive individualism, saying regardless of the costs, each person has to express and cultivate whatever their own imaginative life, their own interior life bids them to do. Whether it be tattoos or artwork or whatever, expressive individualism says, I need to become the person who I am to become. And that often means this freedom from constraints that we talked about. That means breaking free to become kind of my own person. The sort of corollary of these ideas, especially of the expressive individualism. In expressive individualism, if you don't believe me, in American culture, if you remember Walt Whitman, who's kind of a founding cultural figure, his poetry, Leaves of Grass, the start of that poem is called Song of Myself. I sing of myself, and then he goes on to sing of himself, right? Of all that lies within me, all the riches of my own creative potential. Not that there's an issue with being fulfilled in this way, but it's a kind of one-sidedness that we can sometimes fall into. As Hans Urs von Balthasar says, what heresy is, you can see this in the early church, heresy is a truth that has lost its friends. So too with American notions of radical individualism. There is a good, a genuine good to human fulfillment, but if it's lost its friends, if it's lost its originating and essentially productive context, then it can become problematic. So the corollary here for expressive individualism is that the realm of truth is to be centered in the person, in an individual person, who has to go on to define this truth for him or herself. So we don't look so much to traditions, we don't necessarily look to sort of historical organizing principles. We're saying I'm going to go off on my own way, and through that sometimes reckless journey, through that adventure, I'll land upon the truth. to see how kind of deeply this somewhat self-centered vision of the truth can be ingrained in our sensibilities. I remember when Allie went on to get confirmed in the Catholic Church, and one of her friends in her community, or friend's parents, who was not Catholic, said, "I'm so proud of Allie, so happy for Allie, because Allie has found her truth." I said, "Well, that's not really how I would say it. I would say Allie has found God, right? And there's a difference here." So I have The Wizard of Oz and Home Alone up on the screen, because I think each of these movies gives us a vision of with The Wizard of Oz, this sort of Christian pattern of conversion and discipleship, and then Home Alone, something more of the radical individualism, right? With Wizard of Oz, we have Dorothy going off and meeting the Tin Man, the Lion, and the Scarecrow, and each of them kind of go arm in arm, journeying off to see the wizard. There's a sense of that their good will not be achieved except for the participation of each and every member of that group. And you'll notice too in The Wizard of Oz, because I watched the movie again as I was thinking about this for the talk, that what happens when Dorothy meets each and every one of those characters, they all kind of confess their vulnerability, right? Or something of their weakness. Like the Scarecrow falls off of his post and says, "Oh, I just can't figure it out, I have no brains." And then you get the Lion who confessing that he just doesn't have courage, and so on. There's something actually about the communal context that enables us to tell people who we really are, right? Rather than put up some kind of front. On the other side, you have Home Alone. Not that it's a bad movie; it's okay. It's your favorite movie. But what happens is parents leave the guy to his own devices, and through his own ingenuity, he sort of fends off the robbers, right? So it's this rugged individual story, even born back into childhood at this stage. So I hope we're getting that, these kind of models of individual fulfillment, and the first wall being this notion of radical individualism. How can we overcome that in our cultural imagination? The second wall is the wall that we can call systematic envy. And so if with radical individualism, maybe we have what could be a standard definition of pride, because pride is self-sufficiency, right? Kind of a root sin to think that I don't need other people and I don't need God, I'm sorted out on my own. The second wall, when we're talking about systematic envy, also has a big scriptural and theological lineage. We have envy showing up right away in the Bible when Satan, the serpent in the garden, persuades Adam and Eve that they need to eat the tree of the forbidden fruit. What does he tell them? If you eat of this tree, you'll become like gods, right? And God, the implication is God just doesn't want you to be like him. He sort of plants a seed of envy in their hearts. With Cain and Abel, we have that initial sacrifice where Cain's sacrifice is brought, or Abel's sacrifice is brought forth, received well by God, and Cain gets jealous. Okay, this is the context of our first murder. And then in the Old Testament, Joseph and his brothers, you'll remember Joseph was the favorite of his father Jacob. He gives him that fancy multicolored coat. And each of his brothers sort of start to stew about why is Joseph the preferred child? What do they go on to do? They go on to throw him in a pit and leave him for dead, until one of the brothers starts to have some sympathy and says, well, maybe we shouldn't just leave him to die, let's sell him into slavery instead. Point being, you have a situation in which envy is guiding each of these sort of rips in the fabric of our relationships. And we're being taught this through the scriptures, just as we're being taught it in a more direct fashion, maybe, with the 10th commandment, the longest commandment of all of them. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, or your neighbor's ox, or your neighbor's donkey, or your neighbor's wife. It just goes on and on. There's a reason why it's the longest commandment. So Jesus, too, suffers from envy from the religious leaders of his own time, who are envious of his virtue and of his authority. So point being, envy goes way back in our traditional understanding of what sort of stands between the full functioning of our societies. And even St. Thomas Aquinas, who I mentioned before, will see envy as a capital vice, capital meaning capitus as head, which is a root of all other forms of human dysfunction. So the reason why I bring envy up, and the reason why I want to get into a certain dynamic of it, is I'd also like to talk about the thought of this French anthropologist and philosopher named René Girard, and I'm calling him the prophet of envy. And he shows us a little of what he came to the United States, so maybe he needed to be in America to really develop these ideas. Came to the US, and he shows us a little bit of a vision of what can be the seeds of social undoing. This is what's happening almost beneath the surface, as he points out, in our societies that drive us into conflict and lead to violence. So what is the situation here? We can start, before getting to René Girard, with Aristotle, who says that human knowing comes from imitation. In order to be able to do anything, whether it be a skill, whether it be language, we imitate those in our environment. We possess, as human beings, this kind of fundamental instinct to imitate. And so imitation is shot through all of our relations. Imitation not a bad thing in and of itself. But René Girard points out that we labor under this illusion that our desires, especially our higher order desires, are our own. He's kind of contravening this perspective that I talked about, the radical individualism. Oh, I'm finding whatever I desire is my authentic self, my authentic center, and I have that sort of tattoo where I did that painting because it comes straight from me and straight from my heart. René Girard is saying that no, we are incapable of seeing the world except through the eyes of others. We're always in these kinds of imitative relationships with people, and this goes down to our desire. We copy even our desires from other people. The standard case that I can think of, you have like a high school girl who confesses to one of her friends that she really likes some guy. You'll see the very next day, her friend who just received this revelation going up to that guy and sort of, trying to stir up a relationship or something like that. The girl will imitate the liking of this boy just almost automatically or immediately, not out of some kind of undue desire to undo her friend or something like that. It's just how we're coordinated. When we see people like or cherish a certain object, we tend to do the same. So Girard points out that we live in these kinds of relationships. He says that desire has a triangular kind of relationship. There's the relationship between me and my model can be in my environment, or my model can be a celebrity or some external figure, and then the desired object. So in our society, we tend to copy someone's desire, and that leads to this sort of scarcity dynamic. We both want the same thing, not because that thing necessarily is just so great, but because there's a way in which we're feeding off of each other and stoking each other's imagination. And eventually, you have rivalry, you have conflict, and for René Girard, this is the seeds, this is at the source of all sort of violence in our society. You can see it in the United States, for instance. I mean, just look at things statistically speaking. We have enough to go around, most definitely, in terms of food, in terms of basic resources. Why is it that people don't get those resources? Why is it that people don't get fed oftentimes? Because we've become and entered into these sort of self-enclosed groups where we're feeding off of the desires of other people, trying to prove to others our value through accumulation, through this certain kind of growth. So this is a closing down of our field of awareness and a fixing onto objects that lead to dynamics of scarcity. For René Girard, what happens is you end up idolizing, because you're copying these desires from others, both your neighbor's desire and your neighbor. And so the dynamic sort of continues with this push-pull situation. You get tension and discord building up in society and these cycles of violence. Girard goes back to the whole of religious history and says, the way that I've seen in all sorts of different societies that groups have overcome this tendency to disagreement and to deep discord is through the identification of a scapegoat. And in the Bible, of course, a scapegoat is a goat that the people leave their sins on top of. They gather their sins up, sort of, metaphorically or symbolically, and they chase that goat out into the wilderness. For Girard, this is something that happens in all sorts of communities, and there's often a victim, and that victim becomes a sort of unwitting repository, unwitting object of violence. So for Girard, not only do we get into envy, but envy leads to this kind of violence. And as he points out, he says the only model, anytime we're stuck in a kind of modeled relationship, whether it be with somebody in our environment or a celebrity, the only way we can get beyond it is to move from imitation of the other to imitation of Christ. So Jesus Christ for him becomes the only model that effectively gives life. You can see Ali helped me with a slide. These all, in their own way, describe mimetic desire. We had this slide in Portland. So the first one is the principle of why my priest, Argentinian priest, wears Adidas when he plays soccer, because Leo Messi, one of his idols, right, on the Argentinian national team, wears Adidas cleats. And what can he do but copy the desire of another? So mimetic desire has even penetrated into the ranks of the priesthood, you could say. Father Jorge, watch out. So there's that one. Then we have this kind of notion of the need to sort of advertise yourself, because with mimetic desire, what happens, not only do you get locked in a kind of relationship where you desire what others have, but you also find yourself as a model. And you need to sort of live up to that model image that others have of you. So you go on a vacation, and Ali had too much fun with those hashtags, and tell people what a good time you had, that's great. But we end up kind of in this cycle of needing more and more in order to keep up with one another. This is the keeping up with the Joneses phenomenon. This is the two kids, try it at a party or something, you bring a bunch of kids together, and if you have a bunch of toys of equal value, it doesn't matter, because one kid is going to fix their attention on one toy that they need to play with, and that desire is going to sort of cascade around the room, and before you know it, they're all going to be fighting over the same toy. That's kind of how mimetic desire works. And the last one, which is a much starker example, right? This is an image of lynching. This is what we see happening in the South, right? The way that René Girard says, the way that in the South, a lot of conflicts would be overcome, even if you had tension within white society or something like that. You find a black person who maybe looked at a woman the wrong way or something like that, to load all that tension onto. The lynching somehow pacifies the group, right? Buys this temporary peace, and order, effectively for a moment, is restored. Girard says you need to keep intensifying this sort of process, because conflict will return, and we just need more and more scapegoats to keep it going. You can see, certainly in less stark ways, this sort of practice in your own life, the identification of a scapegoat, the temporary peace that it buys, and the ultimate need to sort of find a new scapegoat in order to keep yourself from becoming accountable for some of the negativity that lies in your own heart. So, the reason I point this out, Jesus Christ for René Girard not only becomes the kind of ultimate model that we can fix our attention on, but also is the undoing of this whole process, because he says the difference between Jesus and all former scapegoats, because Jesus in a way is a scapegoat, is that in Jesus, his goodness and his innocence is recognized, at least historically speaking. We have to contend with the fact that we took a scapegoat to the cross, to Jesus Christ to the cross, and we know that as God, right, all perfection and goodness embodied in Jesus Christ, this lesson must be learned. We can't do it again. We can't continue to function this way. So it's René Girard's notion of atonement theory, you could call it, but Jesus as sort of undoing the cycle, both in our own hearts and our invitation, and also as the lesson that leads us forward. So as we look out into our society, into our market economy, we can ask the question, in what way are the patterns of our society mirroring movements towards vice, movements towards envy? Even we know from the Bible that we're doing better when we're not coveting our neighbor's goods. How in our culture are we sometimes led along the path of covetousness? What are the forces at play that sort of stoke up this mimetic desire? Or what are the good sort of countervailing forces that get us beyond these dynamics? And so I want to point out briefly, again, like I said, some of this is condensed, what we can call the logic of the marketplace that somehow starts to feed into our awareness. As this philosopher, Carl Polanyi, pointed out, any kind of economic system that you have in a country will also contribute to its general culture. So you can have a free market economy that translates into something of a free market society, this sort of intertwining. And our minds, and this is what Pope Francis is always pointing out, it's not a remark against capitalism or anything like that. It's a question of how our minds are subtly shaped by these forces in order to see the world in a certain way. So we hear a lot about commodification. We can have even something on the order of the commodification of people, which is to say that we measure people the way that we measure products. If you don't believe me on that one, you can think about how dating apps and dating websites, again, not that there's anything wrong with finding your mate in that way, but what does it do to the person that's putting themselves out in the world? You're trying to identify yourself according to a few pictures, a few choice photos, a couple descriptive qualities. You become less and less the full human being that you are and some kind of package that you're trying to put out in the world. So we can come to live in this kind of commodified landscape. And what we have, going back to envy, is something of the naturalization of vices as virtues, where envy, pride, ambition, and lust, we have the image of Leonardo DiCaprio in The Wolf on Wall Street, if you ever saw that movie, something of all of what was formerly considered problematic can sort of reach a sort of pitch where it becomes admired. Now, if you've seen the Wolf on Wall Street movie, the story of Jordan Belfort, who was a stock trader, came from poverty, rose through the ranks, led an increasingly debauched lifestyle that was not just his own, because a lot of people at his firm kind of started to go along with it with him, whereby he became this desired figure, this object of the idolization, of mimetic desire, if you want, that started to move his culture, that started to move his society. So we can watch out for that sometimes when the market, or the logic of the marketplace overtakes our minds, where we can end up with a naturalization of these vices as virtues, or a sort of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, or the strongest, or what have you, becomes our way of evaluating people rather than a proper gospel logic. Pope Francis talks about a throwaway culture oftentimes. He says, we throw away our goods. We just have this rapid process of exchange, needing novelty and everything else. And he says, but it doesn't stop there, because a throwaway culture often leads to throwing away human beings as well. And he says the unborn, the elderly, and the poor, in his strong words, are often treated as the goods that we no longer want, right? So we'll close this portion of the talk with Pope Francis's quotation. He says this, he says, the emptier a person's heart is, the more he or she needs things to buy, own, and consume. It becomes almost impossible to accept the limits imposed by reality. In this horizon, a genuine sense of the common good also disappears. And this is our concern ultimately with both of these walls of radical individualism and a sort of systematic logical envy, if you will, the disappearance of a concern for the common good. Okay, I'm going to leave it here. Let's give like 5 minutes for a break. Go ahead and walk around if you'd like. Just rejuvenate yourself, because we have a little more to come. And at the end of the talk, what we'll do is have an opportunity for questions. So if you have questions now, go ahead and write them down, and hopefully we'll be able to get to them at the end. Because I know if I take questions coming out of this, we'll never get through it. So, okay, thanks for all your attention. At 7:51. Okay, so we're still working on the second wall a little bit, talking a bit about systematic envy, mimetic desire, these sorts of notions. Again, if you have any questions about it, feel free to ask them again. We'll get there, yeah, we'll get there. But so for the second part of the talk, essentially we're gonna take in hand what we've already spoken about. Talk about some of the healthy movements. I already talked about the imitation of Christ and overcoming mimetic desire, but some of the healthy sorts of transitions that we make that are indicative of conversion. But before we do that, I want to get a little bit deeper, dig a little bit deeper into this cultural fabric. So we should mention the Roman Catholic Church's position on sort of some of these aspects of social life that I'm talking about, some of these dysfunctional dimensions of our public life, whether it be a kind of radical individualism that leads to forgetting about the poor, or whether it becomes a kind of systematic envy that leads to the greed-based dynamics where accumulation becomes the first thought on our mind rather than the good of others. So the Roman Catholic Church has always pointed out, the preferential option for the poor becomes the kind of organizing principle for society and for the relationships that govern both a society and an economy as well. So, interestingly, you heard about some Pope Francis's encyclicals like Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti are examples. The encyclical tradition in the church actually only goes back so far, really, and back to 1893, I believe it was, with Rerum Novarum, which is the first kind of major social encyclical. And then you see Pope John Paul II and Francis and so many others kind of following suit. So it became, at this point, the Pope responding to social ills, it became something of the teaching office of the papacy. And it was a transition from the Pope sort of recognizing a certain kind of authority, recognizing that the Pope is often someone to whom the whole world listens, at least pays some attention to, and so using that kind of office, using that religious authority to speak in a more pointed way about some of the ills of society. So the encyclical that I want to point to is called Rerum Novarum, and it was an encyclical in defense of the working classes, concerned about socialism, the movement to kind of a more revolutionary form of socialism in Europe, and assessing some of the working conditions in capitalist countries as well. And what did Rerum Novarum do? It defended the working classes, defended labor, and initiates this kind of tradition that protects the dignity of each human person. So the idea is, Leo XIII is standing up against child labor, against all forms of exploitation, whether it be coal miners being overworked, whether it be working hours that don't allow a person to rest, or failing to provide a working wage for people. All of this became a part of the Catholic tradition, Rerum Novarum, and it comes out of this principle of the preferential option for the poor. So as we're thinking about what our responsibility is, we remember this: one, the preferential option for the poor; two, the deep coordination between that and the defense of the dignity of each person. So getting back then to what we could call the allure of the American dream, this mimetic, desire-soaked sort of imagination of achievement and of success and what have you. We can talk about the allure of the American dream, and I think sometimes what is neglected is to speak about it according to different classes and how it impacts people, right? Because there's a certain vision for a group for which that dream is more or less attainable, and there are certainly plenty of people for whom it is not. So I remember I worked in social work in San Francisco with traumatized youth for a while, and it really woke me up. There's nothing on TV that could quite do it. I wasn't quite ready for it, to just what degree we live almost in two worlds in the United States. And I would connect the middle class and upper classes as one world, and the poor as something of a different planet, both in terms of the standards of living and in terms of the hopes for sort of escape of some of these difficult situations. But one thing that is constant across these groups is the way that both our media and our culture tends to build up certain desires in people. So I remember what almost broke my heart the most when I was working with one boy who was 8 years old. He so badly wanted a Tesla. And so like every Tesla that would go by, he'd have me pull out my phone and take a picture of it for him. And he sent that to me later. Like, he said, I'm going to grow up and I'm going to get myself a Tesla, like that. And then at that point, I'm going to really have made it. And so for me to hear him say all this and recognize that really there's no way that this is going to happen for him, at least the way that he dreams, given the circumstances of his family, given the way that the deck is sort of in some ways stacked against him, we have to take stock of the way that a lot of the images of our culture and the American dream can sort of be pervade across cultures and have different impacts. And we have to, I think, take a certain degree of responsibility for the way in which the failure of many people's hopes and dreams, as they're promoted in this way, can have a hand in some of the violence, the alcohol abuse, a sense of stagnation that you find afflicting some of these communities. There's a sort of, a ride that a lot of people are going on, and there are so many others who just cannot jump on board yet they still become mesmerized by that journey that others are taking. And so we have the situation of the poor, we have the situation maybe of the wealthy or those who are more well-to-do. And what can often happen here, remember we're talking about Moses making that movement into solidarity with the Hebrew people, is that amongst other classes we can have a fear of crime or fear of some of the violence that we see that oftentimes outweighs the reality of the danger of these environments or these neighborhoods. And the Moses figures, those who are called into solidarity, turn their backs, right, reacting out of fear rather than compassion. And all this does is sort of reinitiate or renew the spiral of violence that so many communities suffer from. So we have the poor who become entrapped in a certain mentality. We have certain segments of the middle and upper classes who are turning their backs out of fear of what goes on with the poor. And we also have something else, which I want to call our attention to, which is the preoccupation of the wealthy or the privileged with their own sort of inner set, with their own kinds of circles, where you find yourself in a certain enclave and unable to make the imaginative leap out of that horizon. And it's precisely that imaginative leap that you often need to take in order to find yourself passionately engaged with people who are not like you in terms of your economic circumstances. So the rich, in many ways, can get caught up in their own anxiety about falling behind. Remember, mimetic desire, us desiring what other people have, and sort of placing our energies in that direction to try to gain and accumulate more, to position ourselves to sort of, in some way, sort of remind us or help us feel a sense of worthiness that might otherwise be absent. That's one thing I neglected with Rene Girard. He says the whole source of mimetic desire, if you look at it, is we all have this sense, this feeling of kind of emptiness within ourselves. We need to grasp at something. We need to grasp at another person who will be our model. Sometimes we grasp at the goods that can sort of lift ourselves up, right? That's why if we're gonna find a model, it's not just about eradicating our desires. And the question is who we turn to and in what way do we turn? So this concern, this third concern about getting caught up in a kind of enclave mentality. There's a story like one of my friends who was working in San Francisco, recently working for a fintech firm, financial technology, and he was told by his boss, working with a venture capital company, to give a certain figure about the company's product, right? And in order to convince them that they would be a sound investment. And my friend said, well, this figure isn't true, right? It costs way more for us to produce this product than what you're asking me to give to them. And so we started off, he went ahead and like through gritted teeth, he gave the venture capital company this number and entered into negotiations. And he found like he just couldn't sleep at night, he couldn't sit with it. And so he came out in their next meeting and said, you know what, I misled you, this is the wrong number, this is what our product really costs. Of course, the venture capital company backs out, right? And what kind of situation does he find himself in with his present company? He says, nobody would say it aloud, nobody would confront me, nobody was gonna be openly angry, but I got the cold shoulder from all of my fellow employees because they knew what I had done. And so he's in the situation, sort of sweating through his workday now, feeling like he's sort of an alien in the midst, or they thought that, even because of his good conduct, that he had betrayed their company in some way. And he says, I really want to quit. Like, I think I should probably leave this job. And so he got on the phone with me and was telling me about the situation. And I said, yeah, it sounds like probably the right thing to do. And he said, but you know what, I just can't. And I said, well, why? And bear in mind, this is one of my friends who is spoiled in his resources, comes from a family who can support him, has the means to continue to thrive, right? His wife is a lawyer, so if he were to step away, she could continue to make money. But he says, I can't do this because, well, we have a mortgage on the house, which isn't entirely true, but my wife really likes to go shopping, and I need to kind of keep that aloft, keep that going. And that's not the true story either, right? The point is that he feels like he's trapped in these kinds of dynamics, that he has to put up a certain image, provide a certain kind of lifestyle, and it's not, again, out of some native desire to have all this stuff. It's because I know at the bottom what's driving him, because he's well aware of what the people in his enclave are doing, the sorts of vacations they're going on, the houses they own. and he feels for his wife that he needs to provide the same thing, right? So the moral of the story, kind of what I'm pointing out, is it is this sort of cycle of desire, this sort of entrapment within a conclave that prevents him from doing what is morally good. So too, we're often prevented, I'd say, from that movement into solidarity because our minds are so absorbed in this sort of consciousness. So pointing out how we can sometimes be impotent to overcome class antagonisms or class differences when it seems so easy. What's really required is a sort of conversion of heart. And envy, the dynamic that we're talking about, can't be overcome by any form of success. This is a great fallacy of envy, that if I, or greed, if you will, that if I get enough of what I really want, then I'll be there, I'll have arrived at the proper station, and I can forget about it all. What will happen is those sorts of desires will just be renewed in a new context, and you'll keep moving along in that way. This is the kind of fly in the spider's web situation, right? There has to be a leap beyond. There has to be building on a new sort of foundation. I think about Jesus' words of building on sand versus building on rock, right? To build on the sort of cultural consciousness of our enclave is certainly a form of building on sand rather than rock. So we can talk about the call of Moses. What if he didn't move into solidarity with his suffering brethren? And I think Pope John Paul II spoke about Francis at the outset. Here's Pope John Paul II's words on this movement into solidarity. He says, solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. There's that word recurring again, both with Francis and John Paul II. That is to say, to the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. And that last little section that's italicized is often the hardest leap to make. We often sort of rationalize or at least find our way around making that sort of statement, that all of us are responsible for everyone, right? And we can kind of find our limitations. So the challenge of conversion that I'm laying out, we have this identification of a false value system. In the first place, the myopic concentration on the self of radical individualism. In the second place, some of these dynamics of systematic envy and what leads to this throwaway logic of the marketplace, including throwaway human beings. And a sort of first step or first idea is that the kind of transition that we might want to make is a consciousness grounded in this freedom from, right? Freedom from deprivation, freedom from any kind of restraint, freedom from a sort of inhibition or a community or a family that will tie me down, to values based on freedom for love, service, and virtue. We can talk too, what I'm emphasizing, about having the courage, finding the courage to look beyond our dominant culture, which, as a matter of course, will bring us to deeper conversion. So casting off the vision of the limiting cultural enclave is part and parcel of the journey of conversion. And what I want to say, and I don't have time to draw it out or to really get to it in full, but some of what seem to be the hardened oppositions that we're contending with can dissolve to some degree when we find a movement in conversion, so we don't feel like we have the same ground to defend, so we can find maybe an empathetic resonance in our environment, so we can focus on the conversion that needs to take place in our own hearts, like the beam and the splinter, such that we're not sort of locking into combat quite so frequently. But that's the first set of suggestions. Now we can say maybe what is the core attitude, what is the stance, what is the appropriate way of being available, because Jesus asks us to be ready at all moments, right? Ready and prepared for deeper conversion. Remember in Moses' story, we could say that empathy is at the heart of his conversion. First, when he gets all broken up about the treatment that he sees of the Israelites, and later when he makes a commitment to be their leader. And empathy, the two gifts that it provides, if I were to pare it down, are one, bonding, right? right? A sense of when you're empathetic, you're no longer focused on what you do or do not have, but you go out in compassion to another. This is what St. Paul talks about with the body of Christ. When one member of the body suffers, the whole body suffers, right? That's because there's empathy at the heart of these relationships. There's that, and there's also bridging, which can sometimes be overlooked, because the people who have that empathy, sometimes who have experience with people who are otherwise marginalized or excluded from groups, like if you think about a person in your community who maybe comes from an immigrant family and will encourage the people in the congregation to maybe pay more attention to the suffering that immigrants go through, to turn their hearts in that way. Empathy in this way as well can be bridging when we challenge our community to attend to or to take stock of others. And the question about empathy translating into solidarity, following what Pope John Paul II was talking about, I would say, so you can have these different sorts of visions of growth, right? And a basic idea, like what does it mean? You could ask yourself this question: what does it mean for a human being to grow? You can get obsessed with whether we're growing or not in all sorts of spheres of life, whether we're a spiritual life or whatever. And there can be a kind of accumulation model, like I'm gaining more gifts or talents or capabilities, but I would say that is the least or less complete understanding of what growth actually is, right? If we're starting from a standpoint of empathy, I think we can see growth as a way of going out to others and letting other people hold a space in your heart. So rather than measuring growth in terms of, what you gathered in terms of skills, abilities, and so on, you can think about growth as how many people are you open to, how many people can you hold in your heart, understand their situation, speak for them in the communities and situations that you find yourself in. So empathy becomes a first kind of antidote to radical individualism. There's a priest at Boston College who points this out to us. He says, sometimes when we're thinking about sin, we get caught up too much in what we do wrong, right? Like these sometimes dynamics of addiction or just being unable to overcome our anger. All these truly are dynamics of sin. He says if we're looking at it from the gospel perspective, I think there's a deeper reading, a different understanding of what sin amounts to. He says sin is the failure to bother to love. He says this is Jesus' definition of sin. If you look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, what happens when the two Levite priests walk past the man half dead on the roadside, right? I think we can talk about, of course, ritual law and everything else, but there's a failure, certainly, to bother to love. And when we think about this crowning passage in Matthew's Gospel, in chapter 25, this is what separates in Matthew's Gospel those the saved from the unsaved, if you will. Jesus speaks, to the person at the gates of heaven, as it were, and says, the person is surprised, why am I here? And he says, well, because you tended to me, right? You tended to me in the poor, in the sick, in those who were hungry, and every time you gave to those people, you gave to me. So too, the sin for which everyone is held accountable is a sin of omission. When people say, Lord, when did I ignore you? When did I overlook you? Well, you ignored me, you overlooked me when you overlooked the hungry, the thirsty, those who needed lodging, and so on. So for this theologian, and I think there's a lot to it, sin is a failure to bother to love, and we sin predominantly not from our weakness, but from our strength, right? It's just when we find ourselves in that self-possessed kind of mentality, when we feel like we're rolling along and we just focus on our tunnel vision, that we ignore those in our midst who we're called to serve and love. So Jesus, we could say, based on these readings and a simplification of it, he wants us to care and he wants us to act on our care. So empathy as a core emotion, what does it serve? What sort of society does it create? What kind of church community? We could say that it's an orientation that is focused on the good that you can do within your community. So there's a philosopher, an American philosopher, whose name is Josiah Royce, who talks a lot about individual fulfillment through community. And what he points out is we can get locked into a kind of binary where we say, I make a decision to cut free from bonds that are limiting me and become an individual who goes out and attains my full development, or I can sort of give to a community and find a way to set aside my individuality and in that way, give up maybe the goods that I otherwise would receive. Royce says this is not the way that things work. The individual comes to their fulfillment precisely through their relationships in community. And he says we can no longer, for Royce, give in to a certain cultural way of what he calls the divine right to be selfish. So for Royce, how do we proceed? How do we go on to discern the situations in our life, the commitments that we make? He kind of challengingly puts it like this. He says, go ahead, be an individual, seek your individual good, seek that good thoroughly, unswervingly, unsparingly, with all your heart and all your soul. Go ahead. However, I persist in asking, where in heaven above and in earth beneath have you to look for your highest good? Where can you find it? Right? This is his kind of testing question. And his answer is that the only place that you'll find your highest good is in a cause that transcends yourself. And more than that, you need an attitude, a kind of proper disposition. You find your highest good in a cause, you find your highest good in loyalty to that cause. Ultimately, for Royce, a kind of loyalty to a religious community. So loyalty, this value that was sort of a persistent focus of his. We could maybe use a different word than loyalty. It's something like fidelity, that sort of Christian value, or devotion, or solidarity. And loyalty for Royce is loyalty to a cause or a person greater than oneself, and this is the means of overcoming the disappointment and alienation of the individual, to which we are otherwise prone. So it's a cause that gives this order, or coherence, or continuity, really an identity to human life. That's when we enter into the sorts of relationships where we have the freedom to do the good, expressed in a kind of commitment to a cause through thick and thin, right? This is Jesus going to his death out of love for others. There's something of this in all the causes that we take on, where we're not necessarily concerned about chasing our own good in that expressive individualism type of way that I was talking about, or even according to utilitarian individualism, where we're focused on the goal, we're focused on the way in which we can serve others. So, kind of closing up with these models of individual fulfillment, Royce emphasizes that, let's see if I can find my page here. If I can't, I can just use the slides. Is it with you? I think it's with you. Okay. So, his individual fulfillment through community. For Royce, the individual and the community are a sacred pair. Communities on their own strength are no good because they ultimately need salvation. We have to have in each of our communities a humble openness to the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, in order to find our guidance, right? So I pointed out at the break, I was saying, like, even a biker gang, people in a biker gang have a sense of loyalty. The person I was talking to said, well, biker gangs aren't all bad. Say, okay, maybe I need a more radical example, like anybody, even in gangs and people who are fixed on violence or whatever, there's a sense of this loyalty, a sense of a cause or what have you. But there's something different with Christian community. And that which distinguishes it is this attitude of humble openness to the Spirit, of waiting for the gift that comes from on high, right? To show us our loyalty, to show us our responsibility, to show us how we are going to serve others. And so the purification of a community comes through this kind of matrix of divine grace, the healing power of the Holy Spirit, that alone can guarantee the goodness and the kind of positive movement. So it's not just about giving yourself to a cause, it's about giving yourself to a higher cause with a transcendent kind of goal. And for Royce, ultimately, the only way that we're achieving a final good is through what he calls loyalty to the beloved community, right? We can talk about that as loyalty to a Christian community. A deeper way of thinking of that is you find your responsibility in your particular parish life, but the way you are ordered in your parish life is the way in which you're ordered to the whole church, right? To the entire body of Christ. You're doing something for the good of others in the concrete that has this kind of transcendent goal, right? That is grace-filled, that leads you along. So religious insight for Josiah Royce, any kind of movement into the body of Christ, culminates in the loyalty to the beloved community. And this is how we understand, by the way, if we've heard the word charism, right? What What is a charism in the church? Charism really just means gift. So anybody who's preaching or teaching or healing or offering counsel or support, all these can be understood as a charism. But a charism is not just an individual gift, it's an individual gift that is given for the good of the whole. This is the notion of the individual fulfillment through community. Okay, so I'm going to close with Dorothy Day, who I think sums up some of these themes. Let's just listen to her. She says, we cannot love God unless we love each other, and to love, we must know each other. We know Him in the breaking of the bread, and we know each other in the breaking of the bread, and we are not alone anymore. Heaven is a banquet, and life is a banquet too, even with a crust of bread, where there is companionship. And this is how she closes. And what I want to point us to finally, we have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community. Okay, so that's where we'll break off. I'll receive any and all questions in the 10 minutes, not so bad, that we have remaining. And Allie's getting nervous because she's going to say, well, if nobody asks a question soon, then I'm going to ask it. You don't have to. Somebody's going to ask a question. So we've got trigger your imagination. You need help, mimetic desire, envy, as these sorts of barriers, radical individuals, and the overcoming of that, both through the personal stance of the heart of empathy, and the movement into the self-surrender, into community, the nexus of relationships that leads to. Yes?
Can we go back to the slide? I didn't finish writing it down on the challenge of conversion.
Sure.
Because that was a huge impact, and I just, thanks.
Okay, yeah. What was it that was impactful? Sorry.
Well, it summed up everything, and there's so much great information in your presentation, and it's just moving really fast, making me wish
Yeah.
for 4 days instead of 90 minutes.
Right.
So, writing it down.
Yeah, and so the last bullet there is the bullet that I leave all of you to work out, maybe the deeper connection there between, because remember I started the presentation by talking about how we feel like we can serve truth or we can serve unity, but we can't serve both. So how does this lens of conversion, and think about it in the concrete circumstances of your life, how does focusing on my own conversion, asking how it is that I can, enter into these communal relationships more deeply and lovingly, asking how I can embrace an empathetic stance, how does that help us through some of the hardened oppositions? How does that help us through concretely with the enemies that I see that I can identify, name your enemies, make a list of them? What is it that I can do to be converted to help overcome that attitude? Is there something there?
What do you mean by hardened oppositions?
Well, what I mean by that is, and we do have a couple of other questions for you.
Sorry.
No, I mean, essentially the idea is that, I said there's a kind of defeatism or pessimism, like we are stuck in our camps. We can make all these critiques of the silos that we live in, but oftentimes we really don't trust or want to converse with people in the other silo, right? So that's the hardness of it, the entrenchment of it, yeah. So question, I saw a couple hands. Okay, right here first.
It's not really dealing with each of your items there.
Sure.
Something that when I saw that you were coming, that kind of stuck in my head is a problem that I'm having with our society in the United States, especially is, and I use kind of an analogy of a pendulum. It just seems like the pendulum is swinging more extremely these days than it used to, and that's what I have trouble as a Catholic. I want to see a little more stability, and it's just like what is the latest, and then people dig in. They dig in that direction instead of trying to compromise in the middle or find attributes that are desirable in both. So I don't know if you would address that at all.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I was trying to get to some extent, and what you could say ails us on both sides, whether you figure it politically, Democrats and Republicans, and you saw it a little bit during the pandemic, is that when is it that we can use the common good, as I pointed out, as a kind of first order principle? Like we do have a tradition of rights-based thinking, absolutely. But often what that can do is just work us back into this position of wondering, how do I preserve my own space and my own rights? And it's already a little bit of a defensive posture. I mean, that's what you get with some of the progenitors of Enlightenment thought. So Thomas Hobbes, for instance, he says, well, in a state of nature, before we have society, life was nasty, poor, brutish, and short, right? And he says the only thing that we can do is find some kind of agreement, some kind of compact to preserve our lives, right? So we're entering into society, into our social relations in a way to help ourselves survive, according to this way of thinking, right? And sometimes when that's carried forward and we're talking about a rights-based logic, which is good, but can become predominant, we can carry forward that way of thinking, right? So the first question is, how do I preserve myself? How do I sort of retain my own integrity? You see it in both the Democratic and Republican sides. Whereas the principle of God's founding, if you look back to Genesis, right, the whole world was created out of love. The Holy Trinity is a community of loving persons who are endlessly giving to one another. You kind of have to believe in that vision as our foundation stone. And that gives you, I think, some of the confidence to speak from that perspective, as opposed to articulating these oppositions and positions in a kind of logic that you could say is fundamentally unconverted, but doesn't get all the way to the story of God's love.
Because like you said about love, you need to know the person too.
Yes.
That's part of love. And I think what happens is people, they're not seeing it from the other side. Or they're not knowing them.
Yeah. And the greatest growth happens in the context of the greatest communion, right? Rather than separation. Yes.
Does the church have a strategy for the loss of our children to the faith?
Yeah.
Based on radical individualization caused by social media?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned the beam and the splinter, so our children have been taught by the former generations as well. So there's something there in radical individualism, if you will, that's passed down, right? I mean, the church has a lot of strategies and talks about the issue of youth a lot, right? I mean, I can just speak from my own experience where I, in a way individually, when I was in my early 20s, moved to Portland, made a commitment. I want to figure out faith, more deeply. I want to be a disciple, but I had no imagination for what a Christian community could look like. And I felt that, some of these themes that I'm talking about, lostness, alienation, I sort of, wanted to be a writer, but who am I even writing to? What is my audience? I feel so out of sorts that it's difficult for me to even understand why I would go on to speak, right? And so it was in the movement in learning from not just a group of priests, but the people who invited us into the community, that there really is a different way of life, right? Founded on humility, founded on service, where people come alive through their charisms, that I was sold that I wanted to give my life in that way. So we can focus on the problem of culture and certain belief systems and everything else, but the church has to find a way to model this beloved community. And it's what will always move people's hearts. Okay, one more question. Anyone but Ali? Okay, we will leave it there. Thank you all. I appreciate it.